Hey everybody, it's Jason with Parallel Reality coming back with you today with an article from The Federalist. This is dated September 16th. It says, there can be no peace or unity with a violent, unrepentant left. And obviously this is coming out of the whole Charlie Kirk situation, just saying left-wingers deciding they're still going to keep calling everybody, the usual words that they call people. And we'll see what this article has to say, because I have not read it yet. It says, enough with the false, lazy rhetoric blaming both sides for political violence in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder. Yeah, the both sides stuff has got to stop. And a lot of the people that are saying, oh, right-wingers commit a lot more crime, yeah, you're wrong. You're, very wrong about that. Go look at the methodology behind some of those statistics you read and where they come from, and you'll realize, oh, wait, you mean they didn't put any of the Black Lives Matter riots in 2020 as left-wing violence? And there's a problem there, and that's not the only one. But anyway, let's get into the actual article. It says, in the days since Charlie Kirk's assassination by a radical Antifa terrorist, a refrain has arisen in the corporate press and the political establishment that we must come together, lower the temperature, tone down the rhetoric, and condemn political violence on both sides. In order to have peace, they say, we have to have unity. But there can be no peace or unity without first telling the truth, and the truth is that both sidesism, the polite fiction that the American left and right have a problem with political violence, is a damnable lie, and everyone peddling it is a moral coward. And case in point is David French, the man willing to say anything for a paycheck and a column at the New York Times. Yeah, for you don't know who he is, he's a guy that used to be a conservative, and then basically when Trump won his first term, he came down with a severe case of TDS and now just supports all left-wing causes at this point. Hence him writing for the New York Times, and not an opinion column once every so often, like a regular thing. It says, over the weekend, French published a piece, and it's linked there where it says a piece. It says, there are monsters in your midst too, arguing that America has a problem with political violence on both the right and the left. To call out the left for Kirk's assassination, or argue that the left is inherently more violent than the right, says French, is nothing more than confirmation bias. In his usual scolding schoolmarm style, French argues that partisan blindness makes it easy to see the evil of the opposition while explaining away or justifying the evil on our side. And the author says, now, normally I don't pay much attention to French, who has built a lucrative media career by punching down at people who are weaker than him. Christians, the working class, conservative families who don't think drag queen story hour at their local library is a blessing of liberty. The kind of people despised by his leftist paymasters at the Times. I've argued in the past that French is by definition unmanly. Nice, and that article's linked there if you want to see that. Because of his penchant for punching down. He viciously and predictably attacks the very people he should be using his position of influence to defend, even if it costs him to do so. And this time is no different. French's response to Kirk's wanton murder by a left-wing terrorist radicalized by Antifa and transgender ideology is to lecture conservatives about their blindness to right-wing political violence. Great timing there, buddy. Says, but since French quotes me, that's not me, Jason, but the author of the article, of course, as an example of confirmation bias on the right, and because his argument epitomizes the kind of brain-dead, morally vacant rationalization of left-wing violence we've seen across the corporate press since Kirk's assassination, I'll respond. First off, despite the dominant narrative in the corporate press and liberal academia, there is no reasonable case to be made that both sides of the political divide have a problem with political violence, or that in the aggregate, political violence on the right is worse than political violence on the left. If all you consume is MSNBC slop and New York Times opinion columns, this might surprise you, since their constant refrain is that the right has had a near monopoly on violence since the 1980s. I lived through the 1980s. No. That's just not true. It says, that's not to say that there is no political violence on the right. That's correct. It says, or no sympathy for political violence among conservatives. No doubt there is. It says, but the outlandish claim that the right is responsible for most of the political violence in our country can only be made by torturing crime statistics and carefully manipulating definitions of what counts as right-wing, while rewriting or whitewashing the American left's long history of political terrorism. And where does that link to? Oh, it's another Federalist article. The left has never been held accountable. Oh, that's from, I just did a video on that last week. Anyway, it says, by contrast, a brief survey of the most high-profile instances of political violence in recent years reveals what most Americans instinctively know, corporate media propaganda notwithstanding. The left, not the right, has the near monopoly on political violence. The difference is that when a leftist carries out an attack, the media ignore or downplay the obvious ideological motivations behind it, just as they have tried to do this past week with Tyler Robinson, Kirk's alleged killer. Yeah, Jimmy Kimmel, this is coming on the heels of him getting his show getting canceled because him just going out there and lying and saying that the killer was actually MAGA. He never was. So that's why that came up. So it says, consider this partial list. And again, partial list. The 2017 mass shooting of Republican lawmakers during a congressional baseball practice was carried out by a left-wing Bernie Sanders supporter. In the 2020 BLM riots, which there were how many of those? Like hundreds? It says at least a half dozen people were killed. I think the last thing I saw is that it was like 33 people were killed. It wasn't a half dozen. It was like 33. And thousands more were injured amid widespread violence and destruction. It was something like, I think, $1 billion worth of damage overall was done. It says, in June 2022, an armed would-be assassin was arrested outside the home of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. I bet a lot of you don't remember that. And that person, it was just announced earlier today from the time I'm recording this, that this person identifies now as transgender. Do with that information what you will. So, again, just probably a left-wing person, I would certainly think. So, in March 2023, a trans-identifying woman, we're coming across a bit of a pattern, Audrey Hale, killed 6 people, 3 of them small children, at Covenant Christian School in Nashville. Last year, Luigi Mangione allegedly assassinated United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in Manhattan, and 2 assassination attempts were made on President Trump. Last month, another trans-identifying terrorist, Robin Westman, attacked Annunciation Catholic School in Minnesota, killing 2 children and injuring 21 others. And, of course, then there's Charlie Kirk's assassination. It says all of these attacks were carried out by unambiguously left-wing terrorists. In making his argument that conservatives are blind to political violence on their own side, French cites a handful of what he clearly thinks are representative cases, including the Minnesota lawmaker and her husband assassinated in their own home, which, by the way, was done by a Tim Walz appointee who was a left-winger. He was not right-wing, as it's been made out to be. And the plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, and I think it's going to go into down here, but the Whitmer thing, from what I remember, was, it was, as it says in the bottom of the next paragraph, it was an FBI entrapment scheme. Okay, so I'm not sure you can count that really as anything. So it says the problem is these examples are incorrect. The alleged assassin in Minnesota, Vance Luther Bolter, was a political appointee of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, a Democrat. Moreover, Bolter's motives were unclear. Among his list of assassination targets were abortion providers, suggesting he had conservative views, of course that would, and yet handwritten flyers with the anti-Trump slogan, "No Kings," were found in his vehicle, suggesting liberal views. And, of course, the Whitmer plot was never successfully prosecuted because the whole thing turned out to be an outrageous FBI entrapment scheme. And if you want to have, like, a good bit of comedy, it was almost like a dark comedy type movie. Go read up about the Whitmer, the whole thing. It's ridiculous what happened. And just everybody was an informant, informing on everybody else. It's just weird. Suffice to say, if you're going to argue that the right has a problem with political violence just like the left does, you shouldn't have to rely on such shaky non-examples. That French does is telling. It reveals not just an inexcusable laziness, but a callous disregard for the truth. It says he did the same thing in his ridiculous column about Cracker Barrel. I don't need to worry about that. But set the examples aside, along with the fraught historical debate about which side has carried out more political violence. The gleeful reaction to Kirk's murder on the left has been nothing less than demonic. The prevalence of self-avowed liberals and leftists who have taken to social media in recent days to celebrate Kirk's assassination, using their real names, seemingly unconcerned about the consequences, reveals a moral degeneracy on the American left that has no counterpart on the right. Simply put, the mask has been ripped off. One side of the political divide in America, and one side only, has shown that it is comfortable with political violence, that it believes it is justified to kill people for holding moderately conservative views, and that it is not interested in peaceful coexistence with the right. Gee, who could he be talking about? Which side? It says this mindset is mainstream on the left. Popular left-wing influencers like Destiny and Hassan Piker routinely call for violence against conservatives and are still doing so even after Kirk was murdered in front of his family. And in fact, Destiny said it was Monday on Piers Morgan, and this was from the time you're listening to this, it would have been a week ago. So if you wanted Charlie Kirk to be alive, Donald Trump shouldn't have been president for the second term. So we're blaming this on Trump somehow, but okay. It says, on cable news networks, journalists are openly making excuses for Kirk's murder. This week, Peter Baker of the New York Times casually talked about how Kirk said a lot of things that riled people up and was symbolic of the toxic culture we're in, which his bloated colleagues nodded along in agreement. Yes, all his moderate Republican takes are, they're bad, right? Says media outlets like NBC News describe people who are publicly celebrating Kirk's assassination as simply sharing opinions, implying it's okay to celebrate assassination, that it's just another opinion and you shouldn't punish people for their opinions. There are thousands of examples of this kind of thing just from the last 48 hours. The purpose of it is to justify Kirk's murder. So no, there is no honest comparison to be made here between right and left. Lesser instances of political violence on the right, like January 6th, says which didn't hold a candle to the violence of the BLM riots that year, which is absolutely correct. Only one person died on January 6th. Her name was Ashley Babbitt, and she was a Trump supporter. And even though there were a whole bunch of cops committed suicide, which is just weird, and the damage was like $1 million. And as I said before, the BLM riots are like a few dozen people that were killed, and there was like $1 billion in damage. So it like pales in comparison to what happened with the BLM riots. So it says the lesser instances of political violence on the right, like January 6th, as we said, are generally condemned by both sides, while left-wing violence is endlessly contextualized, justified, and excused. Peace and unity, then, will have to wait until the left comes to terms with its open embrace of political violence. At this point, both sidesism is nothing more than a cowardly pretext for excusing left-wing terrorism, and calls for unity are nothing more than demands to surrender. As Vice President J.D. Vance said in a powerful address on Monday while hosting the Charlie Kirk Show, there is no unity with someone who lies about what Charlie Kirk says in order to excuse his murder. There is no unity with the people who celebrate Charlie Kirk's assassination, and there is no unity with the people who fund these articles, who pay the salaries of these terrorist sympathizers, who argue that Charlie Kirk, a loving husband and father, deserved to be shot to the neck because he spoke words with which they disagree. Vance closed by saying he's desperate for the country to be united in condemnation of the actions and the ideas that killed my friend, but we can only have unity, he said, with people who acknowledge that political violence is unacceptable and when we work to dismantle the institutions that promote violence and terrorism in our own country. It says those institutions are all on the left. They are well-funded, they are part of the liberal mainstream, and they are unrepentant. Until they are destroyed utterly, those are the only monsters in our midst worth talking about. So very good. I'm still waiting for some article, though, that actually lists out all the, everything the other places, like the ADL, the SPLC. I think there was an economist thing that went over and said, no, the right's more violent than the left, and here's why. And all the methodologies that they use and why they're wrong and incorrect. And frankly, I'm too lazy to go over all of that. And, and also mention, all the stuff that they missed and stuff that they mischaracterized and all that stuff, because they're all flawed. So that's enough of this. Let me know what you think about this in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.